Welcome to day 2 of the Economist Sustainability Week. My name is Carlos Duarte. I'm professor of marine science at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we are here to debate on achieving net zero emissions, exploring the role of the circular carbon economy. For this discussion, we have a slate of distinguished speakers that includes Samantha McCulloch. Samantha is the head of the CCUS unit at the Paris-based International Energy Agency that provides leading analysis and insights on the developments and deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. We also have with us Masakazu Toyoda, who's the chairman and chief executive of the Institute of Energy Economics, which is ranked among the top 3 energy and resource policy think tanks. In addition, he is also a member of the Strategic Policy Committee of the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. We're also pleased to have with us William McDonough, Chief Executive of McDonough Innovation and a globally recognized thought leader in sustainable design and development, with his celebrated 2002 book, Cradletocradle, Remaking the Way we Make Things, which led to the formulation of the concept of the circular economy, and also contributed with his proposing a new language for carbon in a journal, Nature, with an article entitled Carbon is Not the Enemy, published in 2016. We lastly have with us Adam Sieminski, who's the president of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, which is an independent non-profit research think tank located in Riyadh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with a mission to advance the understanding of energy, economics, and environment, acting also as a catalyst for dialogue. Prior to joining KAPSARC, Adam held the James Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and also served as administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA. At this point, I'd like to thank King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center for sponsoring this panel and making this conversation possible. In 2020, COVID-19 disrupted the transport system, brought it to almost a froze. And we also, streets empty, airports void. And the reality of that freeze out is that only 6% of the annual greenhouse emissions were reduced. So now we have a tangible example of what reducing 6% of greenhouse gas emissions from only combustion of fossil fuels means. The challenge is very clear, and achieving the net zero pledges that many nations, corporations, and the world as a whole through the Paris Agreement is pledging is going to be hard and difficult, and will not be met by simply stacking out pledges coming from one nation or another corporation. We need a framework, and last year the G20 nations adopted a new framework called the Circular Carbon Economy that uses 4 Rs that are inherent to the circular economy: reduce, reuse, and recycle, and added one more R, remove, to be applied to achieve a low carbon future. So we're going to debate on this question, and I would like to initiate the debate by asking Masakazu Toyoda, why is reaching net zero emissions so important in the climate agenda?
Well, Carlos, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you for a very important question. The short answer is to save the Earth, to save our human community. I hope it's not overstatement, but in 2015, we agreed with perhaps more than 100 countries that we would make efforts to suppress the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degree Celsius as much as possible. And 2 degree temperature rise compared with the degree below Industrial Revolution in 18th century means that we have to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 for 1.5 degree, 2075 for 2 degree Celsius. And so carbon neutrality is a sort of obligation for human beings, but it's not easy. How we can do that? That's the biggest question. The reason why the temperature is rising when we have a lot of CO2 or GHG. Accumulated GHG could function like a roof for greenhouse for global community, and so the temperature is going to up. I think this is good enough.
So indeed, reaching net zero emissions is absolutely important, but it's also very difficult. And would you, Samantha, maybe share some views with us? Why is this so challenging?
Well, thank you, Carlos. And I would certainly echo Mr. Toyoda's comments on the importance of net zero. And I think, Carlos, you've already really touched on the inherent challenge of achieving net zero. We really need a profound shift in how we use and produce energy. And the context of 2020, I think, is really important. So the International Energy Agency just this month has highlighted that emissions, energy sector emissions, fell 6% last year. And, you know, this is the largest reduction that we've seen since World War II. But I think essentially, you know, a net zero pathway and being consistent with Paris Agreement targets would require emissions reductions in the order of 3 or 4% at least. Moving forward. So that's sort of half to 2/3 of what we saw last year. But of course, we want to achieve this without the economic and social disruption of 2020 and associated with COVID. So, you know, essentially this is a very, very challenging proposition. It is achievable. Just next in May, actually, the IEA will develop a global roadmap for the energy sector to achieve net zero by 2050. But just in terms of some of the initial analysis that we've done around this, I think it's really useful to highlight just the technology challenge and the need for clean technologies. So in a net zero pathway, we think that around half the technologies that we would need to rely on are not yet commercially available today. So we need a very big boost for clean energy innovation and technology innovation. We also need a major boost in clean energy technology investment. Just in the power sector alone, we would need to see energy investments or clean energy investments quadrupling on average between now and 2030. So, you know, a fundamental shift in how we use and produce energy and really trying to drive these emissions reductions, while of course also achieving energy security goals, providing energy access to those that don't currently have it, and continuing to support economic development objectives.
So indeed, a huge challenge and also a huge demand for R&D to advance the technologies that will enable achieving that goal. But will that also require a framework to organize all those actions in a pathway that is coherent? And will probably the circular carbon economy be that pathway? So Adam, can you share your views as to why the circular carbon economy is an important framework to achieve that goal?
Thank you, Carlos. I think you used the right word, the framework. It's a platform or a way of thinking about how to organize the responses to the climate challenges that we're facing. Experts, as Toyoda-san and Samantha indicated already, have largely shown that it's a serious challenge with temperature rise, and that we have to respond to this with all of the tools that we have available. The concept of the circular carbon economy starts with the circular economy and its emphasis on things like reducing waste, making sure that materials are reused, and ultimately using the kind of recycling and recirculation in the natural world as a basis for the first three R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Then, as you indicated, Carlos, you add the fourth R of remove into this equation. It's very unique to the idea of the circular carbon economy. And what that says is that all of the things that we are doing and then that are good, that involve reduce, like efficiency, renewables, nuclear power, and others, and reuse and recycle just simply won't reach the goal that we're trying to achieve, the temperature goal. So we need more options on the table. And those options include carbon capture and storage. It includes direct air capture. It includes hydrogen and other ways of adding to the toolkit that we have available to deal with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that are creating the problem for us to begin with. So taking the concepts of the circular economy and moving them into the area of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions so that we can have a more integrated and holistic approach to the problem.
Thank you. So indeed, a circular economy concept plus remove may help us achieve the goal. But yet the circular economy is a concept that, and I'm now addressing the father of the concept, Bill McDonough, that has been applied to a number of products like consumable products like chairs or carpets, even cars, and perhaps even buildings. But this will require applying the concept to our entire planet. So is that something that may be possible, Bill?
I think it is. And the fundamental reason is that when we started by looking at what we call cradle to cradle, which is the reuse of things, the things coming and things going back to useful agendas, it started by looking at the world as biological nutrition and technical nutrition. There's a biosphere in which we live and a technosphere of the things we make. It's interesting to note that on December 9th, Nature published a paper essentially titled, "The Mass of Human-Made Things Exceeds the World's Biomass." So we've reached a point in history where the mass of human-made things is now equal or exceeding the amount of living things in dry mass, which is an astonishing moment. So this idea of separating into biological systems and technical and making sure they don't contaminate each other is the beginning. From there, we move to circular economy, which, as we've heard, is about reusing, recycling, and considering, in a sense, nature as having sources and humans as converting them into resources. So the idea of reusing becomes essential in circular economy. But now we have this circular carbon economy. And the reason that's interesting is that carbon, which is obviously the source of biomass, it's the living carbon, is both a material in a circular economy of materials, but also the fuel of current technology. So because it's a material and a fuel, it's special. And that's why remove is so interesting, because how many things do we want to remove from the circular economy, which is really a reuse economy? This is something we need to remove from the atmosphere. It's very clear. So by going to circular carbon economy as well as in our toolkit, so Cradletocradle, we have circular economy and we have circular carbon economy, you can then imagine applying to the whole world, because the whole world is biological and technical in terms of objects and systems that we use. So it works at every scale, from the molecule to the material, to the product, to the building, to the city, to the region, to the planet. We've even modeled cities as Cradle cities, circular cities. And it works at every scale because it's following the laws of nature. That's always a good place to start.
I fully agree. As an ecologist, I fully agree that the laws of nature have a lot to teach us about how to organize our human systems. And I'm hearing all of you then voicing the importance of remove, because reuse, recycle, and reduce alone will not get us there. So remove seems to be central to the concept of the circular carbon economy. And yet, I believe that the technology to remove lags behind other technologies. So that's really the area where Samantha's unit is leading the world in exploring how we can activate remove. And I would like to ask Samantha whether you could share with us your views as to how can we activate the technologies to remove.
Sure, very happy to elaborate on that. I think CCUS technologies, so carbon capture, use and storage technologies, which really underpin the remove concept, they have actually been around for quite some time, but I think haven't necessarily lived up to expectations, or the progress has perhaps not been as fast as many would have hoped. But at the IEA, we look at all technologies. So we look at, for our long-term scenario analysis, we look at a portfolio of more than 800 technologies. And we find that, without CCUS, net zero goals are virtually impossible to achieve. And there are a number of reasons that support this role for CCUS. For example, the existing infrastructure today. So retrofitting CCUS is one of the key solutions we have to address existing coal and gas-fired power stations, industrial facilities, and the infrastructure that's built around that. It's also a key technology to support low-carbon hydrogen production and a faster and cheaper scale-up of hydrogen. We also will rely on CCUS technologies for some of the most challenging emissions in the energy system. So that includes in heavy industry. CO2 can also be captured and used in applications to, for example, make synthetic fuels. And these could be particularly important in decarbonising aviation and long-distance transport. And finally, we need CCUS technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere as well, recognising that, when we talk about net zero goals, inherently we understand that it may not be possible to completely eliminate or avoid all emissions. So we need technology solutions as well to help to balance any emissions that are remaining. And here CCUS plays a role. But I would highlight that there has been very substantial progress just in recent years, a new momentum and focus on these technologies. There's a growing portfolio of projects coming through the pipeline. So there's quite a bit of room, I think, for optimism that these technologies can indeed play a role in our net zero goals.
Thank you, Samantha, for sharing your optimism. And I'm delighted to hear that we have more than 800 technologies ready to be deployed. But yet the problem is that the technologies are ready to be deployed, but they're still too expensive because they are not out in the market. They haven't been scaled up and they remain expensive. So how do we break through that vicious circle? We need to activate some policy levers to be able to deliver those technologies and have them tested at scale in the real world, where their economies at scale might make them more cost effective. So, Toyoda-san, what will be the policy levers that can be activated to deploy and make sure that those technologies that we have available can be scaled up and become an important part of the solution?
Well, yes, Carlos-san, you have just said exactly the challenge is cost reduction. I think cost reduction for zero carbon energy. In my view, the most important thing is R&D, promotion of R&D by the government, and also international collaboration promoted by the government. There are four kinds of zero carbon energy at this moment. We could say energy saving is energy. Well, that's one thing. And renewable energy, everybody likes it. And nuclear, some people don't like it, but zero carbon energy, it is true. And fourth, zero carbon energy is decarbonized hydrocarbon, oil and gas, and even coal. And all those zero carbon energy are not perfect. um, I think energy saving, everybody can make efforts, but if we overdo, it's going to be very expensive. And renewable energy, in our view, if the share of renewable energy, intermittent renewable energy goes up above 50%, the system cost would start rising. And nuclear energy, well, I think it's important, but still, sort of public acceptance is a key issue. And so, in our view, in Japan, we tend to think decarbonized hydrocarbon is very important now. And in order to do that, we have to promote R&D and also promote international collaboration. Some people say hydrocarbon is an enemy for human being, but we don't think so. We think hydrocarbon is our friend, but the emission is our enemy. So we have to take out, for our system, we would take out emissions from hydrocarbon to make it friendly for human beings.
Thank you, Toyoda-san. So obviously we need to decarbonize something, but it isn't really clear what is it that we need to decarbonize. So Bill, I'd like to ask you for your views on what is it that we really need to decarbonize, where do we decarbonize it to, and also this concept of a circular economy has been applied at smaller scales, but we are now really talking about a planetary circular economy. Is there any example of that you can bring that give us hope that this may be possible given the need to coordinate across many sectors, nations, corporations, and even perceptions of citizens?
Well, I think that it's a critical question of our moment, and I think so. But again, the examples in history of this kind of thing is really that we don't want to just decarbonize the fuels. We actually want to recarbonize the biosphere. So it's not just don't carbonize, it's really recarbonize places like the biosphere, but also the technosphere, as we heard from Samantha and Toyoda-san. This idea of making, jet fuels out of reused carbon ad infinitum is a really important idea. That's actually recarbonizing. And so you realize, oh, I see, there's subtlety to this. So with certain things we want to decarbonize, which is anything atmospheric, errant, other things like soil, we want to recarbonize. So that's one distinction. The other is on a global scale. If you think back in 1906, former head of the U.S. Soil Conservation Service went to Asia, came back, and he'd written a book called Farmers for 40 Centuries. 4,000 years of perennial agriculture in China, Japan, and Korea. 4,000 years. And what you realize is these cultures, and for example, Paris in the 1800s, they had what they called circulus intelligent, it's called intelligence circle. And the farmers would bring the fruits, vegetables, and so on into the city, and they would be used for food, clearly. And then the horse manure and the waste of the food would be sent back on the carts to the farmers, and that was cycling all the time. That was carbon cycling back to the soils and doing regenerative agriculture as part of a system. So that's a model that was at scale across the globe when people would reuse materials in this way. And then I think another example we could look at right now, since we're essentially in an emergency, is imagine the Second World War. Imagine all of a sudden, as we just heard, it's the largest drop in energy use, until now as a single year. But we'll also realize that we were building ships, in days, and this notion of being on that kind of footing, this fierceness in an emergency, is really, exemplified by what we're going to need right now, which is I call waging peace through commerce by design. And so if you think about the Second World War, that's swords into plowshares into swords. And you realize that the during the Second World War, people collected metal. They composted. They grew vegetables in victory gardens. They did whatever it took and to get things done. And if we go on that footing and start saying, okay, let's start taking everything and putting it into an intelligent circle, then I think that's really key to this whole adventure, is that we understand the urgency and we understand the opportunity and we rise to our occasion.
Thank you, Bill. So that's very inspiring, and therefore we need to activate new technologies, we need to activate policies, but we also need to go back to culture and learn from cultures that were able to maintain circular economies in traditional systems, both in the West and the Eastern hemispheres. So that's really interesting, but we also need to cooperate and activate mechanisms that are maybe intrinsic to war economies. And also we started the conversation by talking about how COVID had led to a major reduction, unprecedented reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, but also it has led to global cooperation of an unprecedented scale that allow us to come up with a range of vaccines within 1 year rather than 10. That makes me hopeful that we can collaborate to meet the challenge of climate action. And I would like to talk in this next block of questions about collaboration. And for Toyoda-san, you mentioned the importance of renewables and deploying renewables, but those renewables are not only uneven in time, they're also uneven in space, and some areas are endowed with very generous solar radiation resources and land areas to deploy solar radiation capture systems. But some others have issues with the space or resources. And in that scenario, then Japan is now leading the global demand for green hydrogen, which is a mechanism to allow trading of renewables. So what is, in your opinion, the role for blue and green hydrogen as a trading mechanism in the circular carbon economy?
Well, yes, thank you very much for a very important question. Japan is promoting the use or development of and use of clean hydrogen. As you pointed out, it could be green or it could be blue. Green hydrogen is produced from renewable energy with electrolysis. And the blue hydrogen is produced from fossil fuel, particularly gas, with CCUS. They are zero carbon energy. The reason why we tend to think it's important is that renewable energy and nuclear, they are important, but both of them provide primary electricity. And yes, at this moment, electricity sector is probably 1/3 of final energy consumption. And it could be increased probably up to 50% or even more than that. But still, we need some fuels for industries and transportation, particularly long distance and heavy duty, and even for aircraft, as some people mentioned already. And so I think hydrogen could meet this requirement. And hydrogen can be utilized for power generation, but mostly it could be utilized for industry use, heating use, and transportation use for particularly long distance and heavy duty. And so this is quite important energy. And we don't care the color, the cheaper the better. And we tend to think now blue hydrogen could be cheaper, at least for the moment, according to IEA. For the moment, it could be cheaper, and they could be provided in a large quantity, And so for the moment, Japan is promoting development and use of blue hydrogen. But if green hydrogen can be produced and supplied at affordable cost, we welcome that. And so this is the reason why I think, or Japan thinks, hydrogen is important.
Thank you, Toyoda-san. So that reminds me of a statement from the chairman of the Communist Party in China once, indicating that the important thing is not whether the cat is black or white. The important thing is that it catches the mice. So really the importance of hydrogen is not on the color, is that it will be zero emission and it allows for trading energy at a zero emission energy across nations. And that's going to be very, very important because energy trades are an important motor of our economy and at the global scale. And again, talking about challenges and perception shifts, not only on the color of hydrogen and new ways of trading with energy, but also in overcoming this vicious circle with carbon capture technologies. Until recently, there were a number of critics that indicated that carbon capture was just a way of shying away from the responsibility of reducing the use of hydrocarbons. And yet, in my reading of the scientific literature, but also the news, I have perceived a perception change in the world, both academics and also the policy world, in terms of what role carbon capture technologies are to play. What were the reasons for this perception change, Samantha, if that has actually occurred?
Thanks, Carlos. I absolutely agree there has been a perception shift. And I mentioned before, a great deal of cause for optimism, I think, now around CCUS technologies. Maybe just to touch on the role of CCUS, of course, this is a technology that's not just about fossil fuels or fossil energy. So in our analysis, there's a very significant scale up of CO2 being captured in a net zero pathway. And ultimately around 40% of this CO2 that's being captured is actually not related to fossil fuels. It's coming from industrial process emissions. It's coming from bioenergy-based processes. It's coming directly from the air through direct air capture technologies. So it is a versatile technology. It's not just about fossil fuels. And of course, that has been one of the criticisms or concerns around the technology in the past. Just on that, I would also perhaps touch on, I mentioned earlier about the existing infrastructure challenge that we face. And, it's important to recognise that, currently around 80% of our energy is coming from hydrocarbons and fossil-based energy, and our infrastructure is supporting that. And we at the IEA did very detailed analysis of the world's power facilities, industrial facilities, and assessed that if they were to continue to operate to the end of their technical life, it could be associated with around 600 billion tonnes of emissions. And so this is around 17 years worth of global energy sector emissions. And it reflects that not just the scale of the infrastructure, but that much of it has been built just in the last 2 decades. So CCUS is a really important technology to be able to support the transition of this existing infrastructure and to enable facilities to continue to operate in a way that's consistent with net zero targets. But in terms of the more recent shift in perception, I think this is certainly something the IEA has sought to highlight in terms of new momentum. Just in recent years, we've seen many new projects coming forward, new investment announcements, and primarily I think it's being driven by perhaps 2 key factors. One is the strengthened climate goals and particularly net zero targets. There's a realisation and a growing appreciation that net zero will require CCUS, whether that's on cement plants, steel plants, existing power generation to scale up hydrogen production, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the company and country announcements for net zero targets are a really key factor in what's sort of driven the new sort of shift that we've seen around CCUS. And secondly, I think the investment environment for these technologies has really improved recently, particularly in the United States, where there's now incentives to invest through tax credits and other measures. but also in Europe where there's new funding programs being developed that CCUS can access. So we've seen a real renewed interest from industry, not just the traditional sort of oil and gas sector or major energy companies, but even from companies like Microsoft and Google and others that are setting these net zero targets and realizing that investment in CCUS will need to be part of their portfolio.
Yes, indeed, Samantha. So CCUS is no longer a burden. It's actually now a business opportunity. And that brings us to discuss the role of businesses and the economy and commerce in addressing the problem and reaching the net zero emission target. Because also in the past months, we've seen a wave of net zero pledges by governments, but also increasing by very large corporations. And up to now, the discussion around climate change and climate action seem to be siloed with governments, and yet businesses can play a very important role. In fact, one of those recent announcements came from a very large corporation whose annual emissions I looked up and are similar to those of Finland. So corporations have actually a major say in how we go forward towards this net zero pathway. And I would like to ask Adam, how can this role that the private sector can play be activated, and how can they embed themselves in a circular economy as well?
Right. How do we get the private sector engaged? Before I answer that great question, Carlos, I want to comment on one of Samantha's points that she made. She talked about the premature abandonment of existing infrastructure and the economic costs that could place on the overall economy around the world. And earlier, Samantha talked about the hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation, shipping, heavy trucking, and industries like cement and metal smelting and so on. But there's a third really important reason, and it's why we're, I think, focused on trying to use a more holistic approach to carbon management, and that is access. For people who have little access to energy already. How are we going to provide that? And for example, there's at least 2 billion people in the world that don't have clean cooking fuels, and maybe propane is actually a good answer to that. And if it is, well, that's a hydrocarbon fuel, and we shouldn't just abandon it because it has carbon associated with it. And Toyoda-san and Bill both talked very eloquently about how we could deal with the carbon that might be coming from something like propane. So providing electricity to people that don't have electricity, providing cooking fuels to the families that don't have that is really, really important. And I think here's where private industry can play a role. If you think about this, again, from a broad standpoint, we need to engage the private sector across the board in the oil and gas industry, in the utilities and electricity provision and manufacturing and transportation and in agriculture as well. Why do we need to do that? We have to have a broader set of solutions than the ones that are available to us now. And generally speaking, that innovation is likely to come from development of commercial solutions, finding ways for companies to turn these into profit-making products that are available to the general public across, again, a full range of sectors. How do we do that? And then we come back to, I think, some of the points that Toyoda-san was making. Governments need to support the companies across this full array of tools, and they need to try new policy approaches, even things that haven't been tested already. Experiment with development and deployment, or at least pilot projects to seek better cost structures associated with those, looking at regulations and standards and financing incentives, all of which would be designed to promote the technology that we're talking about. So how do you get these companies involved? Find ways to allow them to do what we all want to get done, but to have some benefit to the company and their shareholders associated with those activities.
Yeah, so it seems like the secret to achieve the net zero future is actually to activate the economy in many ways. So not only now CCUS are now being seen as a huge economic opportunity, but maybe the whole circular carbon ecosystem can be a way to activate the economy, generate new streams of revenue for companies, new business sectors, and also millions of jobs. And I would like to follow up with this question with Bill, because he advises a number of companies on their strategies to achieve circular economies within their products. So, Bill, what do you think is the potential, the real economy to guide climate action through commerce? Is the economy one of the solutions to, in a positive way, to achieving the net zero future?
Absolutely. In fact, I think the key to commerce is its speed. And, as we look for things to do, it's always useful to discover the obvious. So if we think about it, if you take the idea of policies that are fomenting now, for example, the European discussions around getting hydrogen as policy is a very direct, and Japan is a very direct statement to the marketplace. This is where we want to go. And then the question becomes, who's going to provide this? And that's one. The other is, as we start to see on the supply side, well, the making of green hydrogen, as Toyota said, as a hope, for example. Where do we see that fomenting most valuably? Certainly there's blue hydrogen, which is something we understand, but there's also green hydrogen made from renewables. And if you look at cases like Northwest Australia or Saudi Arabia, indeed, you can see with the lowering cost of electricity that we're looking at the idea of green hydrogen as something incredibly serious and economically attractive as the prices of electricity come down, et cetera. So then all of a sudden you see the convergence of various interests, and it's going to have to be supply side and demand side. I heard ahead of one of the big petroleum companies the other day say, it's one thing to say stop, selling petroleum as fuel, which is an interesting notion. But as long as there's a demand for it, as long as you make cars that have internal combustion engines, there will be people selling gasoline. So on the one side, let's make automobiles that don't need petroleum, and on the other hand, let's start making green fuels. So it's an exciting moment. So I think this is where policy meets purchase orders. And I think that's the speed of commerce. Building on a policy, trying to execute against it, but with purchase orders. So there's real commerce going on here. Very simple example. If a country like Japan or Germany puts out an order for X billion dollars worth of hydrogen of some quality, then that could be received by country go to green hydrogen and say, we'll sell you this much green hydrogen if you will take an order from us, same size, to make electrolyzers, for example, because you get to make steel. And by the way, steel manufacturing loves hydrogen. Anytime you talk to a steel maker, they would so much prefer to be using hydrogen as well. So all of a sudden, you say, let's exchange purchase orders. We'll give you hydrogen, and you'll sell us electrolyzers. You get to stay in manufacturing. You get to make steel. You get to make equipment. That's what you do. We get to make renewable energy into something we can ship around the world. And in the form of ammonia, we're shipping, volatile liquids. We know how to do that. And this is the first time we see massive shipping of renewable power on a global basis, long distance transmission. So I think it's time to let the commerce rise to the occasion and have purchase orders get matched as quickly as possible into whatever the policy structures are that are leading us here to this global necessity.
Thank you, Bill. So purchase orders are going to drive to some extent the circular economy. And in that circular economy, the waste becomes a resource. And therefore, we will be seeing purchase orders for carbon dioxide that has been captured with CCUS technologies. And then some of that then will be injected back into the technosphere as a feedstock for products. But the amount, the size, and the volume of carbon dioxide that need to be captured is far too much to be accommodated into purchase orders for products. So what do we do with the rest, Samantha?
Thanks. Well, indeed, we see that carbon management would become a major sector in a net zero pathway based on our analysis. Currently there's around 40 million tonnes of CO2 being captured from large-scale facilities. We would see this scaling up to billions of tonnes by mid-century. And although in our analysis most of the CO2 that's captured is ultimately stored, and this underscores the importance of really identifying and assessing and developing large-scale geological storage resources, there is this opportunity to use or recycle the CO2 that can really play an important role in terms of not just the circular carbon economy, but in the net zero pathway. And I think these opportunities are in things like jet fuel, so combining the CO2 that's captured with hydrogen, and this produces a fuel that's very similar in property to existing fossil energy or hydrocarbons, and so has particular application in things like aviation because of the challenges of direct electrification or direct use of hydrogen in those sectors. So fuels can be a really large and important market for this captured CO2. Likewise, some chemicals require carbon, so we could take that carbon out of the atmosphere or capture it from existing facilities, for example, rather than relying on fossil energy. So recycling the CO2 to provide that carbon for these chemicals. Also, we can use CO2 in building materials. So this is another really exciting application that's already commercial in some applications today. And I would definitely echo Bill's comments around. I think we need to create markets for these products. So public and private procurement can actually be a really important tool that we can use to, I guess, create the demand and pull through the technology innovation and bringing these technologies and these opportunities to market. I think many CCUS applications in CO2, including CO2 use, really they're at the stage that maybe solar PV and wind were 20 years ago. So what we need to do is really put these broader suite of technologies on a similar path. That's going to come through innovation, it's going to come through deployment, and I think we need to really accelerate this pathway given the urgency of net zero goals.
Yes, thank you, Samantha. And I would like to ask Toyoda-san, what kind of incentives can governments and regulators deploy to activate that industry and that potential of markets that are needed to run the circular carbon economy?
Yes, Carlos, thank you. I think it is industry which could realize circular carbon economy, but government can have a great role in encouraging them to do that and facilitating them to do that. First, the government need to set a target or goal, and then it's a combination of regulation and incentives. To some extent, government can regulate, but that would make industry feel very painful, and so provide a subsidy or something like that. Well, every country or almost all the countries introduce a feed-in tariff for renewable energy. It's a sort of a combination of regulation and incentives. The government force power industry to purchase renewable energy at the outset, even when the price is rather high. through feed-in tariff, and they could provide incentives as well. And then dramatically over the last 10 years, the cost of renewable energy went down. And so I think this is a sort of a combination of regulation and incentives. And also the government can provide the incentive for energy users for promoting energy conservation. And I think many consumers would like to introduce energy conservation schemes, but it is costly. And by providing subsidies, the government can shorten the payback period for those consumers. And now I think many countries try to electrify automobile, and EV or FCV could be promoted, but EV and FCV are relatively expensive compared with traditional car, and many countries introduce a subsidy to reduce the cost of EV or FCB. And so I think a government can play a very important role in terms of setting target and introducing some regulation, but at the same time, it can provide incentives or subsidies.
Thank you, Toyoda-san. And in fact, governments have been at the center of climate policy for decades, but yet the signs are not very encouraging, because the last report of the UN looking at the nationally determined contributions coming to Glasgow at the end of this year shows us a abysmal gap between the pledges that accumulate across nations and what we need to achieve. So, Bill, could you share with us a short statement as to how you can see the circular carbon economy being a tool for global leaders, not only in government, but also in commerce and industry, to collaborate, to activate a momentous climate negotiation to be held in Glasgow in November to be successful?
Well, as an architect trained, our job is to change the way we see. Then we rearrange furniture, and then we build. So when you see what we have in front of us here, the problem is massive. First, the scale at which we need to work is massive. So everybody needs to understand that. The nice thing about the CCE tool and a framework, it allows you to visualize the whole thing, and you can see how it all interrelates. And once you see that, you can find yourself in it, and you find others in it. And the focus on carbon allows us to have a key point of common communication. That's really amazing. And this notion of the sprint to Glasgow is a good one. It's a sprint. Everybody get up and start running, because this is important and it must be big. We have to have massive efficiencies on the order of, could be 60% in the next 10 years. It's massive renewables adoption, massive. It's massive use of CCUS on all the coal chimneys everywhere. Go now. It's really serious. So once you see the whole picture, then beautiful things start to appear. One of the most beautiful for me is that it changes the questions we ask each other. And the question is no longer, as we referenced here with CCUS, is like, what's wrong with the way you're doing it? Which seems to be the typical dialogue. The question is, how can I help you? That's the question. How can I help you? So I make hydrogen. You make electrolyzers. I think we could help each other. So all of a sudden, how can we help each other? That's the key question here, because it requires massive exercises. So I think that's really a nice thing. And as we talked about regulation, Toyoda-san pointed out, once you see the balance of regulation, standards, incentives all starting to work together, one of the things that happen in renewables, besides the feed-in tariffs and various incentive programs over time that have faltering histories, but they're essential, and that's normal, is it went to scale. It went to scale. That's what happened to solar. It went to scale. And so that's really what we're shooting for here. We must get scale, and we must do it fast. That's why they're building, ships in the Second World War for the convoys. Almost in a week, they could build a ship. It was amazing. Well, let's go. How long does it take to make an electrolyzer? So that's the kind of thing that we can share. And then the other thing we can share is look at Iceland. Here's a country in the last 50 years that went from burning coal to being the first renewably powered country in the world. What? That's amazing on all basic energy laws. They're still waiting for their electric cars. But they're using geothermal and hydro in that case because they have it and they figured out how to use it. And just think about what happens when they shared it with China. An astonishing thing. Because they do geothermal for heat loads, they ended up sharing their technology with Sinopec. They now have something like 400 plants where they took out the coal plants and put in geothermal plants for district heating systems. The thing that's so amazing about that is that not only are they putting in the renewables in a cost-effective way, because that's how they heat Iceland. Iceland needs heat. Think about it. But look at China. What happens is they take out the coal plant when they put in the renewable plant. That is magnificent because the chimney comes down while the renewables go in. Because if all we do is add renewables to the existing carbon emitting system, we've increased our energy, but we haven't decreased our carbon emissions. So this is really interesting when we substitute. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's the word I take from your advice is massive and massive cooperation. And I would like then to ask Adam, just to close the conversation, if we are in a world where we see disparate strategies of different nations to achieve the same problem, why do you think that the circular carbon economy can be an instrument to align strategies and achieve this massive cooperation that Bill adamantly recommended as being the solution for the sprint?
Right. I love the way Bill phrased this. What can I do to help? The G20 at their summit meeting in Riyadh, held under the Saudi presidency last November, endorsed the circular carbon economy platform. All 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And what they said was it's really, really important. That's what we've all been talking about here. And we have to reduce emissions. We have to take into account efficiency and, importantly, national circumstances. That the one-size-fits-all idea that some people have of just promoting one solution or not liking another solution is not really going to get us to the goal. That we need to emphasize the ability of every option that's available that reduces the problem, and let people get on with it. Managing the emissions in all sectors, acknowledging the importance of fostering synergies in areas like adaptation and mitigation as well. So get in there. Look at holistically across an integrated set of solutions, try everything, get those costs down, and eventually I think we can actually solve the problem. So that's what the G20 was encouraging all countries to try every tool in the toolbox. Back to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam. So indeed, an industrial revolution that will generate massive cooperation and commerce to change the way we operate, to mimic the way nature does it, as Bill indicated. So I'd like to thank the speakers for your participation and insights, and I'd like to close the discussion by thanking King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center for sponsoring the panel and making the conversation possible. Thank you.